Support comes from Empower Missouri's Affordable Housing Coalition, working to address the causes of housing insecurity and homelessness through tenant advocacy. Information at empowermissouri.org/housing.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll talk with St. Louis Comptroller Donna Baringer about how she's eased into her powerful new job and how the city is dealing with financial challenges emanating from last year's tornado and from state control of the police department. But first, Missouri Attorney General Catherine Hanaway filed an attention-catching lawsuit at the end of last week. She wants to bar certain immigrants from being counted by the U.S. Census Bureau. If this topic sounds familiar, it's because it was litigated near the end of President Donald Trump's first term. Lower court judges ended up rejecting Trump's efforts to bar some immigrants from the census, pointing to language in the U.S. Constitution that requires the federal government to count persons. But since the U.S. Supreme Court never made a final determination in the case, Hanaway is hoping her office's arguments could find favor with the High Court and fundamentally alter congressional redistricting and how much money flows to states. Joining us now from Jefferson City to talk about this case, as well as some other legal matters her office is involved with at the moment, is Catherine Hanaway. The GOP official has served as Attorney General since 2025 and previously served as a U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Missouri and Speaker of the Missouri House. Madam Attorney General, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
It's so good to be with you again, Jason. Thanks very much for having me.
Why did you decide to pursue this lawsuit over which type of people count in a census?
Well, it fundamentally for me was that I wanted to stand up for Missouri's fair share. As the state's Attorney General, I see it as my duty to protect the people of Missouri in any way I can, because people who are not qualified to be counted in the census are currently counted in the census. Missouri gets less than its fair share of representation in Congress, in the Electoral College, and in the drawdown of federal funds. So to me, this is just a case about fundamental fairness.
Some people may see the topic of this being very national in scope. And they may be like, I thought Catherine Hanaway was going to be different from Andrew Bailey and Josh Hawley and Eric Schmidt by not pursuing these splashy, attention-grabbing lawsuits as much. What would you say to those people who would level that criticism at you?
Well, I mean, I don't know why they speculated in any particular direction, and I don't want to speak for people who speculated. What I can tell you is that my motivation here was to stand up for Missourians. And I'll just give the example that in Missouri, we have somewhere between 60 and 80,000 illegal immigrants. It doesn't really have an impact on our overall population. The city of Los Angeles has 2 million illegal immigrants. Effectively, when you count them in the census, that gives California 2 additional congressional seats. If you didn't count illegal immigrants, Missouri would stand to gain at least 1 seat and millions of dollars in federal funding. So I really do think I took an oath to stand up for what's best for Missouri, and that's what I'm doing.
Now, in the introduction, I mentioned that the lawsuit seeks to not count certain immigrants, and I was very careful with my wording there because from reading this lawsuit, this would not include people with lawful permanent resident documentation, or that's the term used for green card. And it would likely not include people who have adjudicated asylum claims. I want to make sure that's correct before I ask the next question.
Well, so I really can't answer the adjudicated asylum claim question. What I can tell you is that when we looked at the law, it seemed very clear that the law says that the people who should be counted for the purposes of the census are anyone who's a citizen, and anyone who has the permanent legal right to be in the United States. So not temporary visa holders, not travelers, not people here on business, not people here illegally, but the holders of green cards do have a right to permanently stay in the United States legally. So on the adjudicated asylum claims, I'm not sure which category they fall into.
So, based on what you said, though, you're not just trying to exclude immigrants who are without legal status, who came over the border and didn't have any documentation. You're also trying to exclude people who are on temporary work visas or temporary student visas. Is that accurate? And would that make this more broad than just targeting immigrants without legal status?
Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. Anyone who doesn't have the right to be in the United States on a permanent basis would not be counted. It is somewhat more broad than illegal immigrants, but the bulk of who would be covered by this is illegal immigrants. And the people who are here on temporary visas obviously are still citizens of their own countries and probably counted in their census. And so um, we don't want to apportion congressional seats, electoral votes, and federal funds to account for those people.
Your lawsuit claims that because immigrants without legal status are counted in the census, states like New York and California benefit with additional congressional representation. But through just a cursory Google search, Texas and Florida have much larger populations of immigrants without legal status than New York. In fact, California only edges Texas by about 200,000 people. So isn't it fair to say that this could end up affecting quote unquote red states as much as blue states that you're emphasizing, like California and New York?
Yeah, and in our lawsuit, we include a map of the entire United States and show the impact on Texas and Florida. We're not just focused on any one state. I think generally, as I refer to it, that the coastal states, to include Texas and Florida, lose congressional seats. The Midwest and the near South pick up some seats. And yeah, it's not a red state, blue state thing. It's a fairness for Missouri thing.
I want to talk about just the ability to quantify how many people either are in states without legal status or have temporary work and student visas. Now, the second category should be easy to quantify because they have documentation with the federal government. But it seems hard to believe that somebody who is in the country without legal status would fill out a form to the federal government, to the census, as much as people who are here legally. So when you say that like Missouri would gain a seat or that California and New York would lose a seat, and even with me, with those estimates I just mentioned, they're all just estimates. So how can you say for sure that this is going to affect one state or another? And I guess I'm asking this question realizing that it's contradicting my prior question that seems to be very sure about the count, but I guess that's holding myself accountable as well.
You're right that they are estimates by and large at this point, but what we, can see in prior census data is the population of the United States growing at a pace far greater than the rate of birth, and that the people who make these estimates, and there's, experts at the Census Bureau, there's experts in academia. There seems to be quite a bit of consensus about the number of illegal immigrants and where they're located.
We mentioned congressional representation a few times, but the other aspect of this lawsuit that is really important is around federal money, since states usually get a certain amount of funds based off their population. But if immigrants without legal status and also temporary visa holders, they still use the roads, they still go to hospitals, they still need to be protected by police, why should states get less money when that money could help pay for those types of services that end up keeping everybody safe, not just people who are specific types of immigrants or citizens?
So that is a great question, Jason, because it really gets to the crux of the matter. The states that have had sanctuary provisions have made the decision to let in far more people than Missouri. And if those states want to have those policies, then they should be providing for the additional costs of having those people in their states. But the states that haven't had those policies, the states like Missouri that have complied with the law, shouldn't be punished because we ignored the law. And that's what's happening right now. We're rewarding states for ignoring the law, for creating sanctuaries to let illegal immigrants into the country. It's just wrong, and it's not fair to the states who are law-abiding.
Do you think this could have a negative impact on Missouri's university towns, specifically places like Columbia, Maryville, Cape Girardeau, Kirksville, where there are a lot of students there who may be here on temporary student visas, but wouldn't be counted if your lawsuit is successful?
Do I mean that if your question is, could some money shift around in terms of allocations on an intra-state basis?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm asking. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, possibly it could cause some shift. I just don't think that the numbers are large enough in terms of our 6.2 million people in the state to have a dramatic impact.
We're talking with Missouri Attorney General Catherine Hanaway about her lawsuit that seeks to exclude certain types of immigrants from the census. So at least one person, Washington University law professor Travis Crum, told St. Louis Public Radio that you may have an uphill battle because of the text of the U.S. Constitution.
And the reason is that the Section 2 of the 14th Amendment mandates the counting of whole numbers of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. And that language has historically meant if you have inhabitants, people who are domiciled there, and the census only counts people who are domiciled somewhere. And so, sort of looking back at how this has been done for decades, they have not excluded undocumented immigrants from the past several censuses. And I don't think that a court decision is going to do so here.
That was Washington University School of Law professor Travis Crum explaining why he does not expect courts to exclude certain immigrants from the census. Madam Attorney General, why is the professor wrong?
Well, I think he actually answered that question for you in his answer, which is that you are only supposed to count people who are domiciled, which is what the law says in terms of case law that has later interpreted what that section of the Constitution means. And I really think that people need to be aware of what a new phenomenon this is. And I mean new in the sense of the whole history of our country. Jimmy Carter was the first one to count illegal immigrants in the census. It wasn't even an issue prior to that. And he made an affirmative decision to do that. President Trump tried to reverse that during his first term. President Biden re-reversed it. I'm oversimplifying a little bit of what happened at that point, but that was the net effect. And so we're saying, let's get a decision on this once and for all. As you pointed out, the U.S. Supreme Court has yet to render an opinion on this issue.
Yes, and that is why this lawsuit is, I think, pretty relevant and why people should pay attention to it. But kind of on the flip side, this has been brought up before. And in 2020, I believe, a panel of lower court judges ruled against the Trump administration on this issue. Why do you think the courts would rule differently this time around?
Well, as we've seen, and this is how cases typically get to the United States Supreme Court, different circuit courts of appeals and therefore different judges come to different conclusions. And it's usually when there's a split in the circuits that something goes up to the United States Supreme Court. This is a very different case procedurally because you have one district court judge who's randomly assigned. And then the circuit court judge appoints a circuit court judge and another district court judge, so a panel of three will hear this, and then it's a direct appeal to the United States Supreme Court. So I think the chances are pretty good that we're going to get to the United States Supreme Court. I know if we lose, we're certain to appeal, and I'm pretty sure if the other side loses, they're certain to appeal. So the reason that the case that you're talking about from the first Trump administration didn't get to the court was that the parties settled the case. So we'll see what happens next.
Why do you think the Supreme Court would find some favor in your arguments, and why do you think that they would even hear it? Because, like, they don't have to hear this lawsuit if they don't want to.
No, but it's just the very recent, like almost contemporary history. I don't know. Can you say that as an oxymoron, contemporary history? But
yes, but I'm going to allow it. Keep going.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So right now they have pending a case on the Voting Rights Act to determine whether or not there should be majority minority districts, and a case on birthright citizenship. So all of these cases go to the fundamental issue of how should we assign congressional districts. So it's clearly a topic they're very interested in at the moment.
Your lawsuit asked for a redo of the 2020 census, and St. Louis University demography and sociology professor Ness Sandoval says from a practical standpoint, that may be very difficult to pull off.
There are hundreds of thousands of people who are there are hundreds of thousands of people who are dead today that were alive when the census was done. You have babies who are born today that were not born in the 2020 census. How are you going to deal with this growth and decline of population over the past 6 years?
That was St. Louis University's Ness Sandoval on why redoing the 2020 census, which is asked for in Attorney General Hanaway's lawsuit, may be impractical. Madam Attorney General, I know you are also asking for changes to be done prospectively in the 2030 census, but why ask for a redo if it's going to be practically very difficult to actually pull that off?
Well, there are lots of things that are complex and practically very difficult. Professor Sandoval regularly does an excellent presentation on the changing demographics of the St. Louis region. He relies on some census data, but he makes other projections not based on census data, and it is possible to do it. So the reason we want to redo the 2020 census is we want to get relief as soon as we can so that Missouri doesn't continue to be underrepresented in the Congress, underrepresented in the Electoral College, and not get its fair share of federal dollars. The state budget is very tight this year. Hundreds of millions of dollars could make a real difference. And, it's every federal program that you can think of where we're not getting our fair share.
Wouldn't it cost a lot of money to redo the census? I'm getting word that it costs $14 billion to do the 2020 census. So is a redo worth it when the next census is going to be done, I don't know, 2 years after this case likely concludes?
Well, I think whether, in fact, the court grants us this relief will depend a lot on when the case gets decided. If this case gets decided in 2029, which is only 3 years away, and it wouldn't be unusual for it to take 3 years for a case to get to the Supreme Court, it's pretty doubtful that the court would grant us this relief. If the court is very interested and puts this on a rocket docket and it gets decided this year, yeah, I think it'd be fundamentally unfair for us to have to go through another congressional election cycle, 2 more election cycles, underrepresented as a state, and 3 or 4 more budget cycles. So it's my job to fight hard. I'm going to fight hard. Sometimes your reach exceeds your grasp, but you got to go for it sometimes.
Staying on the topic of redistricting, next week could mark the beginning of one of the most important cases over the new congressional map lawmakers approved last year. The ACLU of Missouri is arguing that the new map that is effectively frozen after a group called People Not Politicians submitted signatures to place the measure up for a referendum. Your office says the new map is in effect at this very moment. Why is the ACLU of Missouri wrong here?
Well, they're wrong because we have a court order that says they're wrong from the Eastern District of Missouri, but they're also just like wrong on the fact that what the law says is that the referendum as proposed becomes the status quo when sufficient valid signatures have been submitted. But knowing that they're sufficient and valid only happens after the Secretary of State's office certifies those signatures. Until that time, whatever the new law is what governs.
There is Missouri Supreme Court precedent, though, that says the submission of signatures causes a targeted law not to go into effect. Why wouldn't that precedent matter in this situation?
Sufficient valid legal signatures. It is not directly on point in this situation, and that was a statute that wouldn't necessarily have had an immediate effect, whereas this is congressional districts that are relevant to the elections that are about to be held. Remember, filing's just about to open.
Yeah, and I'll have a question about filing at the end, but I think the reason why I'm really confused about this is I was around in 2017 when the opponents of Right to Work submitted a lot of signatures to Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, and there has not been a single millisecond in the history of Missouri when Right to Work was in effect, because as soon as those signatures were turned in, Secretary of State Ashcroft said Right to Work is frozen, and no one ever challenged that. So again, I'm just a little bit confused what the difference between those two situations are, because that situation was only 9 years ago. This wasn't 50 years ago. So what say you on that point?
Jay Ashcroft was wrong.
Okay. Why was he? Oh, I guess he's wrong because of the reasons you just mentioned, correct?
Yeah, I mean, here's why he was wrong, is because if you do not interpret it as being sufficient valid signatures, people could show up at the Secretary of State's office with literally anything, boxes of paper, and say, we have submitted our signatures. The law should be frozen as the old law. And that's just not what the law says, what the cases say, and it's not the right thing. People have a right to petition for a referendum, but there are requirements on what those signatures need to look like. And so at the point when sufficient valid signatures have been certified by the Secretary of State's office, that's the moment at which it becomes frozen.
I mentioned this as important, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand why I think that way. Secretary of State Denny Hoskins told me he won't decide on whether the referendum has made the ballot due to sufficient signatures until August. And if the map froze in early December and Hoskins sticks to that timeline, I cannot imagine any scenario, even if he rejects the referendum in August, where the new districts would go into effect because of U.S. Supreme Court precedent around not changing districts close to an election. So is my feel on why this potential decision is important? Like, are my instincts correct here on this is a really important question to answer, especially since filing starts later this month, actually?
Yeah, it is an important question. You're absolutely right. That case you're referring to is the Purcell case, which basically says that election authorities shouldn't interfere with elections when you're getting very close to the time for filing, for campaigning, and for the election itself. And so which districts are in effect has a great deal of bearing on which ones are in effect now and for the next several months will probably be determinative of which ones are used for the actual election.
So the other major case on the horizon is one on whether redistricting in the middle of the decade is allowed under the Missouri Constitution. Your office already got a win on this case. Cole County Judge Christopher Limbaugh wrote, "In these situations, Missouri courts have consistently held that the legislature has the power to act unless expressly prohibited. Given the fact that the Constitution contains no restrictive language, this court concludes that the legislature had the power to enact the new map. This case will be argued before the Supreme Court on March 10th. What are your expectations for what the Supreme Court will do here? Because on the one hand, this has never been litigated before, so I have no idea what they're going to do. But on the other hand, even though the Missouri Supreme Court has 5 judges that were appointed by Republicans, they're often pretty unpredictable on how they decide things and often make Republicans like yourself cranky and mad. How are you feeling going into that case with that backdrop?
Well, I never feel cranky. I am a cheerful warrior, I hope. And I like this battle. If you look at Judge Limbaugh's order, it's very clear. I think our chances with the court are very good. Even though it is a case of first impression with them, the Constitution is pretty clear that the legislature has an obligation to redistrict every decade, but it doesn't have a limitation on how often they can do it. So cheerfully, we'll go to the court.
Catherine Hanaway is Missouri's Attorney General. She was appointed to the post in 2025 and previously served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Missouri and as Speaker of the Missouri House. Madam Attorney General, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Jason. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our cases.
We need to take a quick break, but when we return, we'll talk with St. Louis Comptroller Donna Baringer about her first year in the important post. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Donna Baringer has been a staple of St. Louis government and politics for more than 2 decades. She served as an alderwoman for the city's 16th Ward, which encompassed southwest parts of St. Louis. And in 2017, she began an 8-year stint as a member of the Missouri House. After unseating longtime Comptroller Darlene Green last year, Baringer now plays a major role in the city's key financial decisions. And she's also had to play a major role in the city's recovery from the May 16th tornado and longer-term issues around pay for city employees. Baringer joins us in studio to talk about her transition into the Comptroller's office and her vision for the state's financial future. Madam Comptroller, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you for having me.
And as a disclosure, Comptroller Baringer was my state rep and my alderwoman for many years before I shamefully absconded to St. Louis County. You were the first St. Louis Comptroller in roughly 30 years who was not named Darlene Green. Mm-hmm. So what was your transition into this office like, given that the leadership hadn't changed throughout a pretty large span of time?
It was a whirlwind. I can tell you that right now. The big difference, and so I want to explain that now, is that the Office of the Comptroller, all the employees are civil service. And what that means is that there are no exemptions. And when the mayor won her race, she got to appoint everyone in all the departments because they were under her in her cabinet. So that's not to say it's good or bad. What it is that there was within the office, there were people that were used to the way things were. And I came in and I wanted to update us, especially via technology. So I was paperless, and that was kind of difficult for some people at first because they were used to printing emails. Yes. Yeah.
Printing emails. Okay.
Yes.
Continue.
So, and I'm the opposite. I don't like paper. I prefer to put everything on my iPad, and then I can go over reports and I can write on them with my iPencil. And then when I go into meetings, I have everything right there with me. So that right there was a big change.
Now, before we talk about some of those changes, I think it's important for our listeners to know what the comptroller actually does and what she's responsible for. So what are your key duties now that you're in the citywide office?
So we are in charge of all the money for the city of St. Louis. So when it comes to contracts, when it comes to paying people who get those contracts, when it comes to bonding, like going out for the airport and getting bonding, we are the office that does that. And all the accounts receivables and accounts payable are done through us for the entire city, not just our department. So we see the financials for every single department across the entire city. We work with over 10,000 vendors from all those different departments that need to be paid. And that is I call the accounting side. The other side would be development and real estate. All assets in the city of St. Louis are under the comptroller's name. So every port lease, every building that's under the city, the LCRA, if they want to sell the properties, I have to sign off the deeds. So the real estate as well. And so when we're going to develop a property and it's going to be using an asset that's under the city, I have to sign off on that asset before it can be sold. So it has two different things going on there.
What are some of the major changes you've been able to implement since you started the job last year? Have you given all of your employees like an iPad that they can write on, or are they still printing out emails at this point?
No. So what happened is that the day I started, I had 2 stacks of contracts in my office that were almost as tall as I am because they only did wet signatures. And what that meant is that the paper, I don't know how many trees they would go through a week. So we have a program called Oracle, and it took from the day I started, and we rolled it out completely the second week of December for the entire city. So every department has to use Oracle, which means everything is on the computer. So if you don't know where your invoice is, let's say you're a nonprofit and CDA has given you a grant for $250,000, you want to draw down on that $250,000. We first would have to set the account up, and then we'd have to pay the invoice that's submitted by CDA. The problem is that no one knew where anything was because it was paper, and the contracts have to go through 7 different departments. You didn't know which department it was in, and then when it finally hit the comptroller's office, it had one thing wrong on it. It had to start all over again.
Wow.
And it took,
That makes my head hurt, even just you explaining that.
Yes, it took up to 3 to 4 months minimum to get these contracts set up and get them open so people can draw down on the invoices, the contracts. And so we finally rolled it out. And what happened which is what we wanted to happen, is that now we were able to put contracts into the system and get them approved in 7 days. And now if you are a nonprofit and you have submitted your invoice to the department that's supposed to submit it to us, we are doing it within 1.5 days paying you.
Was this in motion before you got elected, though? Because you mentioned it started in December, so I imagine that you didn't just come in and start this process before when you got elected.
Yeah, I apologize. When I say we rolled it out in December, I meant this year, December 2025.
Got it.
Yeah. Oracle had already been used for doing payroll.
Okay.
However, there wasn't a process put into place that trained all the employees, and that's why when they rolled it out, it kind of blew up.
Got it. Now, we haven't mentioned the other aspect of your job that makes you, at times, the most powerful city official in the entire city of St. Louis. You're on the Board of Estimate and Apportionment.
Correct.
And if there is a disagreement between Mayor Kara Spencer and Board of Aldermen President Megan Green, you basically have the tie-breaking vote on key financial decisions. And how does that feel to be that potentially influential? And more importantly, have there been instances where there has been a disagreement and you've had to make the key decision?
That hasn't happened yet. I'm sure it'll happen in the future because it's always happened with every mayor that there's going to be 2 that are for and 1 against. But what I can tell you is that I see contracts. Not only do we first go through E&A. So if you want a contract with the city, you go through E&A and we have to vote on it. And when I was starting to look at these contracts, I was seeing things that were making me feel uncomfortable. And one of the things that made me feel uncomfortable is no risk assessments were being done for some of these nonprofits. And so I said, I want us to make sure that we're not putting contracts to people who can't actually deliver because they either don't know how to do a business plan or they haven't had a business plan. They don't know how to write grants or do the reporting on grants. So we put that in place. So I know that anyone who sits on E&A, whether it's the mayor or the president board of aldermen, knows that my first look is the financials. Is this in the best interest of our city? Are we doing it the best way we can? Is it a good reason to spend money or not a good reason? And we have those conversations.
I do want to talk about something that you were more involved in than people may realize, and that's the entire saga over the Alfred Montgomery ouster as sheriff. Can you talk a little bit about what your role was in that situation? Because I know that there was an audit that I think your office put out, but I think that it was more than just an audit, and I think it's important to put the sunlight on your office about how you got entangled in that very high-profile web.
Okay. So in the city of St. Louis, we do our budget. And when we do our budget, every department is given the dollar amount that they get for the year, the fiscal year. What had happened is that we allow someone, a department, to go up to that dollar amount that they have set for their budget. But then once they go over it, then it has to be approved. So what had happened in the case of the sheriff's office is that they had let go of, I think, 12 civil service employees whose jobs are guarded and protected. You can't just fire them. You have to have cause. And then you also have to pay out their pension, their deferred comp, their sick leave, their vacation. And so when that happened, that was almost $500,000. So we were having the budget hearings right after I came on, and the sheriff was asking for more money, but everyone said, well, you already have this many more months before you get your next chunk of change. And so we, as the person who oversees the money, if you've gone past what you're approved to have in money, we cannot write more checks for you. So what happened is that I had to tell the budget committee that the sheriff's office had already gone past what they're allowed to in the budget by $500,000, and that here is why. And I gave them the numbers because we keep the books. Mm-hmm. And I showed here is how much has been spent. But then something interesting then came up from there. Well, then how did he pay for the Tahoe? And I said, I don't know. So I went to my accounting people and found out that the sheriff, and this isn't the first sheriff, all previous sheriffs, they have private bank accounts. So when they have those sales, tax sales on properties, they put those in those private accounts. So that's where the money was being drawn down from for the Tahoe, the golf carts, the badges, the uniforms.
Now, that's different from other county offices because sometimes when somebody enters, say, recorder of deeds or elsewhere, they can hire whoever they want and they can fire everybody else.
Yes.
And you mentioned you didn't think one was good or bad, but is it possible that maybe like the county offices need some sort of standardized way they hire people? Like they either have to be mostly civil service and maybe a few that are exempt or all exempt? Because it seems like having this jumbled system is probably not great for the city.
Well, it's not. And I tell people, I said, our problem isn't that we can't find people to work for the city. The problem is that certain jobs, if they're civil service, they pay less than the other positions. There's 3 types of employees in the city of St. Louis. You got civil service, you have exempt, which is usually your at will, they're appointed, and then you have your county offices. And they all are on different pay scales. They all can do whatever they want, but the civil service employees have to follow very, very strict guidelines set forth by the personnel department. And sometimes they're just not doable, and it's unfair.
We need to take a quick break, but when we return, we will have more of our conversation with St. Louis Comptroller Donna Baringer. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. We now return to our conversation with St. Louis Comptroller Donna Baringer, and we have a phone call from Eric from St. Louis who has a question about something that you may in the future decide on.
I wanted to thank Comptroller Baringer on her great public service. As a small business person working in the city for 50 years, it's been a real pleasure. And I wanted to know your thoughts on the Rams money and if it has been if there's any settlement on that, where it's going to be spent, and if not, your thoughts about where it could be sent, and what else you've done to improve your office, which I'm sure you've done a number of things based on who you are.
Well, thank you for calling. I appreciate it. And actually, the Rams money is one of the reasons I ran for this office in general, because I was up in Jefferson City and we had the Build Back Better funds. We had ARPA funds. I saw all this money being funneled into the city of St. Louis, but I didn't see it getting spent. I didn't know where it was going to be spent. And I knew that this is once in a lifetime and you have to be very careful about how you spend the money. And right now, what I did for the mayor was I pulled a report that showed we had $126 million still unspent in the ARPA funds. And so we need to make sure those are spent down first, because that bucket of money goes away on December 31st. And so when people ask me about the Rams money, I say we have to be very careful how we spend it. If we spend the principal, we should always spend the interest and use it to leverage to get other money. Use it as matches for federal money, as state money. But we need to make it so it is used in a wise manner that promotes our city and grows our city.
On another topic that I think is top of mind among the city is the future of the St. Louis Police Department. It has been about a year since a state board was placed back on, because there was a state board before the mayor's office had control over it. The appointees from Governor Kehoe were just approved, I believe, a week or so ago. There's talks about giving police officers raises of about 7%, which I understand is going to take a little bit of time to figure out what that means and how they get implemented. What do you kind of make of the first year of having a state board? Because it's controversial among city officials. A lot of people do not like the aspect of it being there. They don't like the lack of autonomy. But I think you kind of have a unique perspective because you represented a lot of people in the southwest side of the city who wanted a state board. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested, how do you think it's been going so far with all the voluminous backdrop I just mentioned in that question?
Well, the 7% pay raise in and of itself, we know our officers need to make more money. There's no question there. So what other people don't realize, because all the assets are under the comptroller, is that we have to turn over the assets to the state. And we are working through that right now. And that's no easy task, because we did take out bonds for the police headquarters. So we owe the bondholders. So that's something we have to work out. It's a legal issue. It's I know people think it's all happening quickly, but it doesn't. It's going slow, so we do it correctly and we don't get in trouble.
What do you think would be the barometer for success? That was something I asked Governor Kehoe. And I think we're going to need to wait a few years before we see if this is successful or not. But for you, what would that be?
Well, I have to tell you, I was actually in my office, and all of a sudden I can see out the window coming down the street 20 young men jogging. And they were, there's a police car in front with its lights on, police car in the back. And I went, oh my gosh, that's a recruit class. And I think 20 is pretty large. Maybe it was 30. I apologize. But to me, that was a very good sign that we are actually getting more police officers on the street.
I did get a perception, because this is an anecdote. I used to send my daughter to a daycare in the city, and I ran into somebody who worked for the St. Louis Police Department. And I asked him, what do you think of state control coming back? And he was pretty excited about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that was pretty common among the people there. But I do want to talk about the tornado recovery. There is a perception that it's going really slowly and not going fast enough. Do you think that perception is correct, or do you think it's going as fast as it can given how big the damage was?
What I can tell you is this would not be my first time working with FEMA. And FEMA came in Ellendale neighborhood that I represented as a state rep because of the flooding. And so I learned that FEMA is very clear on their rules. And if you don't go directly by the rules they set, they will not reimburse you. So we literally just finished up some of the last legislation. The Alderman, Brett Narayan, he did it.
Narayan,
I apologize. But that was 3 years ago. That was 3 years ago. Yeah. And so I tell people FEMA goes slow as molasses, but you have to have everything correct. So I had accountants that did not take overtime but worked nights and weekends after that happened. When everything was coming in, they were reviewing it to make sure it fell within the guidelines, made sure we were tracking it. I did something that hadn't been done. I have my email on my phone. You can get a hold of me at any time, anywhere, literally. And I was able to do what's called DocuSign. Mm-hmm. So when we had the emergency contracts that needed to like move the trees, do this. At 2:00 in the morning, they could send it to me and I could DocuSign it. So it was immediate. There was no holdup on getting money to get people out there to do what needed to be done.
But I imagine that one of the issues and why it hasn't gone faster is you have to do due diligence to make sure the contractors can actually do the job. If somebody bids for debris removal and you review it and you're like, this company is not capable of doing this, then the whole process has to start over.
Correct.
Is that basically one of the problems here?
No. Actually, I think one of the problems is just when it comes to rebuilding, right?
Yeah.
Different people have different ideas of what they want that to look like. But at the end of the day, you still have to follow the law. And the law says you have to know who owns the property and is it insured. And that has been the biggest hurdle to overcome because we have multi-generations living in a house, but the person who actually owns it is dead. And so we're cleaning that up in the courts. And then if you didn't have insurance, we're trying to get in there. Here, let me tell you what I did do. And this is something that didn't make the headlines, but I was so proud of my employees. And the reason this is full circle is because when I was in Jefferson City, I worked on the legislation for the vacant and abandoned properties in the city of St. Louis to be torn down. And then we put a $15 million match. So the city had to match the $15 million, and we gave $15 million from the state. We get a call the other day saying, oh my gosh, we still need to spend $7 million more, but we're not quite sure if we have it. My accountants had been tracking all of the teardowns on the properties. So we were able to match the funds. So now they've been replenished. Now we have another $15 million to tear down abandoned and vacant properties. And so we're also identifying those to make sure if they came down during the tornado, that those funds could be used to actually remove that building because it complies.
In the last minute or so, I want to ask you a broader question, something I asked the mayor. I feel that if the city and the county were under one emergency management system, the immediate response to the tornado would have been a lot better because the county has a much more sophisticated and well-funded system. And if the city paid into it, maybe the sirens would have gone off. You've talked about consolidation between the city and the county for a while. Am I off base here? That
No.
Maybe this is something that we should talk about more as far as like city and county having joint things they do with each other.
Yeah, I don't call it consolidation. I call it regionalism. And the reason I call it regionalism is because with the tornado didn't stop at the city line. It went right into the county. And if we had a city-county mutual agreement worked out, it would have been more efficient. Same with the health department. And anyone under 40 right now that comes into St. Louis says, what is wrong with you people? Why are you so separated? And I tell everyone that is why we're having an issue, a perception of us. But if we were one county, in other words, we just stayed the city of St. Louis, all the municipalities stayed the same, but we became one county, we would start qualifying for hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funds because that money is based on our population. And right now, the county alone and the city alone does not qualify for all the money Kansas City, who does it through Jackson County. That's how they get their money. Jackson County applies for those funds.
Well, we will be talking about consolidation more, and we will welcome you back to be part of that conversation. Donna Baringer is the comptroller for the city of St. Louis. And before she was elected last year, she served 8 years as a state representative and roughly 13 years as a member of the Board of Aldermen. Madam Comptroller, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.